The wind blew softly through the tall trees. Birds sang in the distance, and the sound of a small river echoed nearby. Even Callahan walked carefully through the thick forest, carrying his backpack and a sharp knife on his belt. The sun was setting, and golden light touched everything. Even loved coming out here, far from the town. The wilderness felt like home to him. He enjoyed the quiet, the peace. It was where he felt most alive. Today, he was searching for herbs and plants for medicine. His mother had taught him how to find useful things in the wild before she passed away. As he climbed over a fallen tree, something strange caught his eye. A thin line of smoke was rising between the trees, not far from where he stood. Even stopped. No one should be out here, he thought. There were no other houses for miles. Curious and a little cautious, Even moved closer, pushing branches aside. The smoke grew thicker, and soon he smelled something burning. But it wasn't wood. It was sharp, like burning metal. When Even finally stepped out into a small clearing, his eyes went wide in shock. In the middle of the clearing was a strange ship, broken and lying on its side. It looked like nothing he had ever seen. It was silver and smooth, with strange glowing blue lines running along its side. Parts of it were smashed, and sparks jumped from open wires. Even slowly walked closer, his heart beating fast. Is this a spaceship? He wondered. He had seen pictures of spaceships on the news, but nothing like this. Suddenly, a soft groan made him stop. His eyes searched around until he saw her, a girl lying next to the ship. She wasn't human. Her skin was pale, almost white, with a soft glow as if tiny lights were moving under her skin. Her hair was silver and flowed around her like silk. Strange symbols were marked along her arms and neck, glowing faintly. She looked young, maybe his age or a little younger. Her clothes were torn, and her arm was bleeding a light blue liquid that shimmered in the sunlight. She looked weak, barely moving. Even felt a rush of emotion. He couldn't just leave her here. She needed help. He quickly knelt beside her and gently touched her shoulder. "Hey, can you hear me?" he asked softly. She opened her eyes for a moment, bright violet, glowing slightly, and looked at him with fear and pain. "It's okay. I won't hurt you," Even said, trying to sound calm. But inside, he was nervous. What if she doesn't understand me? Still, she didn't pull away. That was a good sign. Even looked around. Whoever, or whatever, had attacked her could still be near. He couldn't leave her here in danger. "I'm going to help you, all right," he whispered, as much to himself as to her. Carefully, he slid one arm under her back and the other under her knees. She was surprisingly light, like carrying a feather. As he lifted her, she winced but didn't fight him. Sorry, Even murmured. "We'll get you somewhere safe." With effort, he carried her away from the crashed ship. The forest was thick, and moving was slow, but Even knew these woods well. His cabin was about a mile away, a small, cozy place he had built with his father years ago. As he walked, he kept looking around, alert for danger. The sun was almost gone now, and darkness crept between the trees. Finally, after what felt like forever, Even saw his cabin through the trees. It was small but sturdy, with a wooden porch and a stone chimney. He pushed the door open and carried the alien girl inside, laying her gently on his bed. He quickly went to get his first aid kit. "All right, let's see what I can do," he said to himself. Her arm was still bleeding, though not as much now. Even carefully cleaned the wound, and to his surprise, her skin seemed to heal a little on its own, like it was knitting back together. "You're something else," he whispered, watching in wonder. She watched him quietly, her violet eyes following his every move. Even gave her a small smile. "You'll be all right. I'll take care of you." For the first time, her lips moved, and though the words were soft and strange, Even could feel the meaning. "Thank you." He sat back, amazed. "You do understand me." The girl slowly closed her eyes, as if trusting him enough to sleep. Even sat by her side, watching her breathing softly. His mind was racing. Who is she? Where did she come from? And why was she alone? But one thing was clear to Even. He had to protect her, no matter what. The morning sun peeked through the cabin window, shining on the girl's glowing skin. Even sat on a chair beside the bed, still watching her. He had barely slept. His mind was full of questions. "Who are you?" he whispered, but of course she didn't answer. She looked peaceful now, but Even remembered how weak she had been last night. He hoped she would wake up soon, so he could find out what happened to her. Even got up and walked to the kitchen. He made tea and thought about what to do next. He couldn't take her to town. People would panic if they saw her, and if someone had attacked her ship, they might come looking for her. He had to keep her hidden. When he turned back to check on her, he saw her violet eyes open, watching him quietly. "Oh, you're awake." Even smiled, trying to look friendly. She blinked slowly, her eyes filled with confusion and a little fear. Even moved slowly so he wouldn't scare her. "You're safe here," he said softly. He pointed to himself. "I'm Even." The girl tilted her head, as if trying to understand. Even touched his chest again and repeated, "Even." She watched him, then pointed to herself. "Lyra." "Lyra," Even said, repeating her name. "That's a pretty name." Lyra gave a tiny smile, but her eyes were still filled with worry. Even brought her a cup of water. "Here, drink. It will help." She looked at the cup curiously, then slowly reached out and took it. Her fingers brushed his hand, and for a moment, a soft light moved from her skin to his, like a small spark. Even felt a warm, peaceful feeling, but said nothing, not wanting to scare her. As she drank, Even sat back down. "I found you near that crashed ship. You were hurt pretty bad." Lyra looked down at her arm, where Even had wrapped a bandage. She touched it softly, then looked at Even and gave a small nod, as if to say thank you. Even smiled again. "You're welcome." They sat in silence for a while, just watching each other. Neither knew how to speak the other's language, but something deeper was starting to form, a quiet trust. Suddenly, Lyra raised her hand and a small device on her wrist lit up. She touched it carefully, and a tiny blue hologram appeared, showing a strange ship being attacked by other ships. Even leaned closer, watching the little glowing pictures in awe. "Is that what happened to you?" he asked softly. Lyra nodded sadly. She touched another button, and a picture of her home appeared, a world with floating cities and beautiful skies. Then the picture changed to a map of the forest they were in. A red blinking dot marked where they were. Even understood. "They're looking for you, aren't they?" he said quietly. Lyra's eyes filled with fear, and she gave a small nod. Even stood up and looked out the window. "Don't worry. You're safe here. I won't let anyone find you." Lyra watched him closely, as if trying to decide if she could really trust him. After a moment, she reached into a small pouch at her side and took out a small glowing stone, placing it gently on the table between them. Even looked at it curiously. "What's this?" Lyra pointed to the stone, then to him, and then to herself. Even frowned, thinking, was it a gift? A way of saying thank you? He smiled softly. "For me." She nodded slowly, her eyes softening. Even picked up the stone and held it carefully. It was warm in his hand and glowed brighter when he touched it. He smiled. "Thank you, Lyra. I'll keep it safe." Lyra seemed happy, as if she understood his words. After a while, Even made some food. Simple soup and bread. He wasn't sure if she could eat human food, but when he offered her a bowl, she took it. She tasted it carefully and then gave a small smile. Even chuckled. "Not bad, huh?" Lyra nodded, her eyes sparkling a little now. She pointed to the soup and said a word in her language, something soft and musical. Even repeated it, and she laughed gently. He smiled. "I guess you're teaching me your language now." They spent the rest of the day like that, sharing words, laughing when Even said them wrong, and slowly building a way to talk without really knowing how. But as the sun began to set, Lyra suddenly looked worried. She stood up weakly and went to the window, looking out into the forest. Even stood beside her. "What is it?" She pointed at the sky. Even followed her gaze and froze. Strange lights blinked far above the trees, moving slowly. "Are those the ones who attacked you?" Even asked, his voice serious. Lyra didn't answer, but her hand gripped his sleeve tightly, her eyes full of fear. Even looked at her and nodded. "Don't worry, I'll protect you." Lyra turned to look at him, searching his face, and then slowly she gave a small, grateful smile. The next morning, the forest was quiet. Birds sang softly, and the sunlight came through the windows of Evan's cabin. But inside, Even and Lyra were both awake, thinking about the strange lights they had seen last night. Even made breakfast, but his eyes kept moving to the window, watching for anything unusual. Lyra sat on the bed, watching him closely, as if trying to understand his feelings. "Nothing out there yet," Even said, bringing her a plate of bread and fruit. "But we need to be careful." Lyra took the plate and gave a small smile. She pointed to the window and said a word Even didn't understand, but he guessed she was asking if they were still safe. "For now, yes," Even said softly. As they ate, Lyra took out her glowing stone and placed it on the table again. Even smiled. He knew by now that the stone was important, a sign of trust and friendship. After breakfast, Even decided to show Lyra the small garden behind his cabin. "Come on," he said, holding out his hand. Lyra hesitated for a moment, but then took his hand gently. Even led her outside, where the sun warmed their faces. "This is my little garden," Even said proudly, pointing to rows of vegetables and herbs. "I grow food here. You want to help?" Lyra looked curious and nodded. Even handed her a small shovel and showed her how to dig holes for planting seeds. She watched carefully, then tried it herself. Her hands moved slowly, but she seemed to enjoy it. "Good job," Even said, smiling. Lyra smiled back, and for the first time, she laughed softly, a light sound like music. Even's heart warmed. They worked together for a while, planting seeds and watering the plants. It felt peaceful, like the danger from last night was far away. But when a bird flew too close, making a sudden sound, Lyra jumped and grabbed Even's arm. "It's okay," Even said gently. "Just a bird. See." He pointed to the small animal flying away. Lyra watched it, then let go of his arm, but her eyes were still worried. Even sighed. "You've been through a lot, huh?" Later that day, Evan took out some paper and pencils. "If we can't talk much, maybe we can draw," he said. He drew a picture of himself and pointed. "Even." Then he pointed to Lyra, and she smiled and drew a picture of herself. "Lyra." They laughed together. Lyra then took the pencil and began to draw something else, her home planet. Floating cities, tall towers, and beautiful flying creatures filled her drawing. She showed it to Even, her eyes shining with love for her world. "Wow," Even said, amazed. "It's beautiful." Lyra smiled, but then drew a dark shadow over part of the picture. Enemy ships attacking. She looked sad. Even touched her hand gently. "I'm sorry," he said. "That must have been scary." Lyra looked down but gave a small nod. Trying to cheer her up, Even stood and went to a shelf. He pulled down a small box and took out a music player. "Do you want to hear music?" he asked. Lyra tilted her head, curious. Even turned it on, and soft music filled the cabin. Lyra's eyes widened in wonder. She reached out and touched the device, smiling as the music played. "You like it, huh?" Even said, smiling. Lyra nodded eagerly. Then, to Evan's surprise, she stood and began to move slowly to the music, her body swaying like she was dancing. Even laughed. "You can dance. That's amazing." Lyra smiled brightly, and for a moment they both forgot the danger outside. As the sun began to set, Even and Lyra sat by the fire. He cooked simple soup while Lyra watched the flames, looking thoughtful. Suddenly, she took her wrist device and pressed a few buttons. A small hologram of her family appeared. A man, a woman, and a small child. They were smiling and waving. "Your family?" Even asked softly. Lyra nodded, her eyes growing sad. Even felt his chest tighten. "You miss them, don't you?" She nodded again, wiping a small tear from her cheek. Even reached out and gently took her hand. "I'm sure they miss you too. And I promise, I'll help you get back to them. You're not alone now." Lyra looked at him, her violet eyes soft. She squeezed his hand gently and gave him a thankful smile. As night fell, Even sat by the window, watching the sky. Lyra came and sat beside him, holding her glowing stone. "We'll figure this out," Even whispered. Lyra leaned her head on his shoulder, and for the first time, she seemed truly calm. Outside, the forest was quiet, but Even knew the peace might not last long. The next morning, Even woke up early. The sunlight was soft, and the birds were singing again. But something felt different. He couldn't explain it, but a strange feeling of worry filled his chest. Lyra was still asleep, curled up peacefully in the bed. She looked calm, and Even didn't want to wake her. He stepped outside quietly and looked around. The forest was still, but Even's sharp eyes noticed something strange. Footprints in the dirt near the trees. Even knelt down and touched the marks. "These aren't mine," he thought. "Someone's been here." His heart began to beat faster. Who had come this deep into the forest? He stood up and scanned the trees, but saw nothing. Going back inside, Even locked the door and windows. Lyra woke up when she heard the sound. She sat up and rubbed her eyes. "Even," she said softly, using his name. He smiled to calm her. "It's okay. Just being careful," he said. Lyra tilted her head, sensing his worry. She stood and walked to the window. When she saw Even's serious face, her own smile faded. "They might be here," Even said quietly. "The ones who hurt you." Lyra looked down, her hands shaking a little. Even quickly took her hands gently. "Don't worry," he said. "I'll protect you." Lyra looked into his eyes, and slowly she nodded. Even tried to keep things normal. "Come on, let's eat something," he said with a small smile. They sat at the table, but both were quiet. Lyra picked at her food, her eyes on the window. Even tried to act calm, but his ears were listening for any sound outside. After breakfast, Lyra took out her wrist device. She touched it carefully, and a small blue shield appeared in a hologram. She pointed to it, and then to the cabin. "You want to make a shield around us?" Even asked. Lyra nodded, but then she pointed to her wrist and shook her head. The device was broken. Even sighed. "So we need to fix it." Lyra nodded again and showed him a small picture of a part, something that looked like a glowing crystal. "Where do we get that?" Even asked. Lyra thought for a moment and then pressed a button. A map appeared, showing a place deep in the forest. Even looked at the map. "It's far, but I can go." Lyra shook her head quickly, grabbing his arm. She didn't want him to go alone. "I'll be careful," Even promised. "We need that piece to protect you." Lyra hesitated, then slowly nodded. She touched the glowing stone she had given him and held it to his chest, as if telling him to keep it close. Even smiled. "I'll take it. It will remind me of you." Before he left, Evan gave Lyra a small wooden stick. "If anyone comes, hit this on the floor. It will make noise, and I'll hear it." Lyra held the stick tight and gave him a soft smile, though her eyes were still full of worry. Even put on his jacket and stepped out into the forest, following the map. The trees were tall, and the wind whispered through the leaves. As he walked, Evan kept thinking about Lyra. "I have to do this for her. She needs to be safe. After about an hour, Even reached a strange place. The trees were burned, and pieces of metal were scattered on the ground. Parts of Lyra's ship. In the middle of the wreckage, the glowing crystal shone faintly under some metal. Even walked carefully, watching the sky. He reached down and picked up the crystal. It was warm in his hand, and it pulsed with soft light. Suddenly, Even heard a sound, a branch snapping nearby. He turned quickly and saw two figures in dark armor standing at the edge of the clearing. They were aliens, tall and sharp-eyed, holding strange weapons. Even's heart pounded. They must be the ones who attacked Lyra's ship. One of the aliens pointed at him and said something in a strange language. Even knew he had to act fast. He turned and ran, holding the crystal tight. Behind him, the alien shouted and began to chase him through the trees. Even ran as fast as he could, jumping over roots and rocks. His legs burned, but he didn't stop. I have to get back to Lyra. I have to protect her. Finally, he reached the cabin and burst through the door, locking it behind him. Lyra jumped up in surprise, but when she saw Even's face, she knew something was wrong. "They're here," Even said, breathing hard. He held up the crystal. "But I got this." Lyra's eyes went wide. She took the crystal and quickly worked on her wrist device. The crystal fit perfectly, and the device began to glow bright blue. Outside, they could hear footsteps coming closer. Even looked at Lyra. "Can you make the shield now?" Lyra nodded and pressed a button. A soft humming filled the cabin, and a glowing blue shield surrounded the house. Just in time. The aliens reached the clearing and tried to approach, but when they touched the shield, a spark of energy pushed them back. Even and Lyra watched from the window. "You did it," Even whispered. Lyra smiled softly and touched Even's hand. "Safe." Even looked at her, his heart full of determination. "We'll keep fighting. Together." Outside, the aliens watched the cabin, but they couldn't get in. For now, Even and Lyra were safe, but Even knew the danger was far from over. The next morning, Even woke up to the soft light of the sun shining through the windows. Lyra was sitting quietly near the window, watching the trees. She still held her glowing stone in one hand, as if it gave her strength. Even stretched and stood up. His body was sore from running and working all day yesterday. But when he looked at Lyra, he smiled. "Good morning," he said softly. Lyra turned and gave him a small smile. "Morning," she said, her voice gentle. Even walked over and sat beside her. "They're still out there, aren't they?" he asked, looking at the trees. Lyra nodded. She pressed a button on her wrist device, and a small screen showed two red dots moving near the cabin. "They're watching us," Even said quietly. Lyra looked worried. She pointed to the dots and then to herself, as if saying, "They are after me." Even gently took her hand. "We'll figure out a way to stop them. I won't let them take you." Lyra looked into his eyes, her own filled with trust. She nodded slowly. Even stood up and looked around the cabin. "If they try to break in, we need to be ready." Lyra watched him as he walked around, checking the door and windows again. She wanted to help. She stood up and gently pulled on Even's sleeve. Then she pointed to the glowing stone on the table and her wrist device. "You can use this to make something?" Even asked. Lyra nodded and motioned like she was building something. Even smiled. "All right, let's see what we can make." They sat together at the table. Lyra showed him how to connect small wires from her broken tools and place them around the glowing stone. Even handed her pieces of metal and small batteries from his toolbox. For hours, they worked side by side. Even watched as Lyra's hands moved carefully, fixing small parts and adding pieces. "You're really smart," Even said, watching her work. Lyra smiled but kept focused. Finally, she finished building a small device that looked like a disc with lights on it. She showed it to Even, then pointed outside and pressed a button. The disc began to float and flew out the window, stopping in the air like a little drone. "Whoa," Even said, surprised. "What does it do?" Lyra smiled proudly and pressed another button. The disc began to send out a wave of light, scanning the area. The screen on her wrist showed a map with the 2 red dots still outside. "It's watching them for us," Even said, understanding. "Now we'll know where they are all the time." Lyra nodded. Feeling a little safer, Even cooked lunch. They ate together, sitting by the window, watching the drone as it floated around the cabin. But Even couldn't stop thinking about what would happen if the shield stopped working. "We need a backup plan," he said. Lyra looked at him, waiting to hear more. Even took a deep breath. "I know a place in the mountains. It's a cave, hard to find. If things get bad, we can run there." Lyra listened carefully. "I used to camp there when I was younger," Even continued. "No one will find us there." Lyra nodded, understanding. Even smiled. "We'll pack some things, just in case." For the rest of the day, they packed food, water, and tools into 2 bags. Even found a warm jacket for Lyra and gave her a pair of sturdy boots. "They're a little big," Even said with a laugh as Lyra put them on. Lyra smiled and walked around slowly, getting used to them. As the sun began to set, Even and Lyra sat outside the cabin on a small bench, watching the sky turn orange and pink. "It's beautiful," Even said. Lyra nodded. She pointed to the sky and said softly, "Home." Even looked up at the stars, thinking about Lyra's family and her planet far away. "I'll help you get home someday," Even promised. Lyra looked at him with wide, thankful eyes. She reached out and gently touched his hand. They sat in silence for a while, just watching the sky. But as night fell, the red dots on Lyra's wrist screen began to move closer to the cabin. "They're coming," Even said, standing up quickly. Lyra followed him inside, and Even checked that the door was locked tight. Lyra pressed her wrist device, and the blue shield glowed brighter, ready to protect them. "Let them try," Even said firmly. "We're ready." Lyra stood beside him, holding the small stick Even had given her, her eyes serious now, no longer afraid. Outside, in the darkness, the 2 aliens watched from the trees, their glowing eyes fixed on the cabin. Inside, Even and Lyra stood together, ready for whatever would come next. Night had fallen over the forest, and darkness surrounded Even's cabin. The only light came from the soft blue glow of Lyra's shield that hummed quietly around the house. Even stood near the window, watching the trees. His eyes were sharp, and his hand rested on a strong wooden stick he had shaped into a weapon. Lyra stood beside him, holding her small scanner. The red dots on Lyra's screen were closer than ever. "They're coming," Even whispered, his voice calm but serious. Lyra nodded, her eyes full of worry, but also courage. She didn't want to run anymore. She wanted to stand and fight, especially now that Even was by her side. Suddenly, a flash of red light shot out from between the trees and hit the shield. Sparks flew in the air, and the shield shimmered but held strong. "They're testing it," Even said, trying to break through. Lyra quickly pressed buttons on her wrist device, strengthening the shield. She looked at Even and gave a small nod. "It will hold for now." But Even knew it wouldn't last forever. Another blast of red light hit the shield, this time harder. The ground shook slightly under their feet. Lyra's face was pale. She showed Even the screen. The shield's power was dropping. Even looked at her. "If they get in, we run to the cave. Remember?" Lyra nodded quickly, holding her bag tight. Suddenly, from behind the trees, 2 armored aliens stepped out, holding strange glowing weapons. Their eyes glowed in the dark as they looked at the cabin. Even gripped his wooden stick tighter. One of the aliens raised a small device and pressed it. The blue shield around the cabin began to flicker and shake. "No," Lyra whispered, pressing buttons fast, but the shield was breaking. With a loud crackling sound, the shield went down. Even stood in front of Lyra. "Stay behind me," he said firmly. The aliens moved closer, speaking in a strange language. One of them pointed at Lyra and said something loud. Lyra's hands trembled, but she didn't step back. Even raised his stick. "If you want her, you'll have to get through me first." The aliens paused, looking at each other. They didn't expect a human to fight them. Then one alien aimed his weapon and fired. A red beam shot straight at Even. But just as it was about to hit him, Lyra jumped forward and pressed a button on her device. A small fast shield appeared in front of Even, blocking the blast. Even looked at her with surprise and then smiled. "Good work." Lyra gave a small smile back. Realizing they couldn't take Lyra easily, the aliens started moving fast, trying to go around them. Even swung his stick hard when one of them got close, hitting the alien's arm. The alien growled and stepped back. Lyra pressed another button, and a small blue shockwave pushed one alien away, sending him crashing into a tree. Even laughed a little. "You're full of surprises." But the second alien was smarter. He dodged the shockwave and moved behind them, reaching out to grab Lyra. "Look out!" Even shouted. Lyra turned just in time, using her device to send out a flash of bright light that blinded the alien. The alien covered his eyes, giving Even the chance to swing his stick and knock him down. The first alien got up again and aimed his weapon. But now, Even and Lyra were ready. Together, they moved fast, dodging the beam. Even ran forward and hit the alien's hand, knocking the weapon to the ground. Lyra picked it up quickly, looking at it with sharp eyes. She pressed a button, and the weapon shut off. She smiled and looked at Even. "Smart girl," Even said, grinning. But they knew it wasn't over. The second alien was getting up again, and more red dots appeared on Lyra's screen. Reinforcements were coming. Even's smile faded. "We have to go. Now." Lyra nodded. She grabbed her bag and held Even's hand tightly. Together, they ran out the back door of the cabin and into the dark forest. The night was cold, and the wind whispered through the trees, but they didn't stop. They ran fast, following a narrow path only Even knew. Behind them, the aliens shouted and searched, their lights flashing in the dark. But Even and Lyra kept running. Finally, after what felt like hours, they'd reached a rocky hill. Even helped Lyra climb, and soon they stood in front of a dark cave. "We made it," Even said, breathing hard. Lyra smiled, but her eyes were still filled with fear. Even gently touched her shoulder. "It's okay. We're safe here." He led her inside, where it was warm and quiet. The sound of water dripping echoed through the cave. Lyra sat down on a rock, tired but safe for now. Even sat beside her. "We'll rest here. Tomorrow, we'll figure out what to do next." Lyra leaned against Even, and for the first time that night, she felt a little safe. Outside, in the forest, the aliens searched, but Even and Lyra had escaped. For now, the cave was dark and quiet, but Even and Lyra finally felt a little safe. They sat close together, resting against the smooth rock wall. The only sound was water dripping from the cave ceiling. Even looked at Lyra and gave her a soft smile. "We're safe for now," he whispered. Lyra smiled back, though her eyes were still tired. She leaned her head on Even's shoulder. Outside, the night was still, but Even knew the aliens were searching for them. He couldn't let them find Lyra. "We'll need a new plan," Even said, thinking out loud. Lyra slowly sat up. She took out her glowing stone and her wrist device. She pressed a few buttons and showed Even the screen. It showed a map with red dots moving around the forest. "They're still looking for us," Even said, frowning. Lyra nodded. Then she pointed at the sky on the screen, where a small spaceship icon appeared. "Is that your ship?" Even asked. Lyra smiled and nodded quickly. She typed something into her device. A line of alien text scrolled across the screen, and then Lyra looked hopeful. "You can call your ship," Even asked, excited. Lyra nodded but then frowned. She showed him the screen again. The ship was far away, and it would take 1 day to reach them. Even sighed. "So we have to survive 1 more day." Lyra nodded sadly. Even stood up and looked around the cave. "We can do it. We just have to stay hidden. They won't find us here." Lyra stood up too, walking deeper into the cave. She used her glowing stone to light the way. As they explored, they found a small pool of clear water. Even smiled. "Good. At least we have water." Lyra dipped her hands in the water and smiled. It was cold but fresh. They sat by the pool for a while, resting and thinking. "I wish I knew more about them," Even said. "Why are they after you?" Lyra looked at him sadly. She took out a small hologram from her bag. It showed her planet, a beautiful world with purple trees and 2 suns. Then the image changed to show ships attacking her world, with fire and smoke everywhere. Even's eyes widened. "They destroyed your home." Lyra nodded slowly, a tear in her eye. Even felt anger rise in his chest. "That's why you're running. You escaped them." Lyra nodded again, wiping her tear. Even gently took her hand. "You're not alone anymore. I'll help you." Lyra looked at him, her eyes full of trust. As the day turned to night, Even and Lyra made a small camp inside the cave. They ate some of the food Even had packed and talked quietly. Even told her stories about Earth, about growing up near the forest and loving the stars. Lyra listened with a soft smile, sometimes laughing at his funny stories. Then, as they sat by the pool, Lyra suddenly touched Even's hand. She pointed to the sky outside the cave, where stars sparkled brightly. "Home," she whispered. Even looked up and smiled. "Someday, I'll take you back there." Lyra looked at him and shook her head softly. She pointed at her heart, and then at Even. "Home," she said again, meaning he was her home now. Even felt his heart beat faster. He smiled warmly. "You're my home too." They sat together, holding hands, feeling safe for the first time in days. But as morning came, Even woke up to Lyra shaking his shoulder gently. She pointed to her wrist device. The spaceship icon was closer now. "Your ship is coming," Even said happily. Lyra smiled wide, her eyes bright with hope. But suddenly, they heard noises outside the cave. The aliens had found them. Even stood up quickly, grabbing his stick. Lyra grabbed her device, ready to fight. 2 aliens stood at the entrance of the cave, blocking their way. Even stood in front of Lyra. "I won't let you take her," he shouted. The aliens raised their weapons. But just before they fired, a loud roaring sound filled the sky. Even and Lyra looked up. Lyra's spaceship had arrived. The ship hovered over the forest, shining a bright blue light down at the cave. The aliens looked up, confused and scared. From the ship, a beam of blue light shot down, hitting the aliens and knocking their weapons away. Lyra pressed a button on her device, and the ship opened a door, sending down a platform to lift them up. Even and Lyra held hands tightly as they stepped onto the platform. Slowly, it lifted them up into the safety of the ship. Inside, the ship was warm and bright. Other aliens like Lyra, with kind faces, greeted them. Lyra hugged Even tightly, tears of joy in her eyes. Even smiled. "You're safe now." Lyra looked up at him and took his hand. "Stay?" she asked softly. Even looked around the ship, then into Lyra's eyes. He smiled wide. "Yes, I'll stay." As the ship flew high into the sky, leaving the dangerous forest behind, Even and Lyra stood side by side, looking out at the stars. A new journey was beginning, together.